as people come in. But so the Country Bookshop is pleased to welcome Gayle Tzemach Lemmon to chat about her book, now in its second week on the New York Times Bestseller list. Congratulations, The Daughters of Kobani. First, I do want to introduce the Country Bookshop. We are in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina, and we are a general bookstore for kids and adults, and we are part of a really, really wonderful community who chooses to shop with us and share their stories and their lives with us and celebrate great books like this one. We are kind of unique in that we're a bookstore that is part of a small community, twice weekly award-winning newspaper called The Pilot. And so that really kind of ties into the core of the bookshop, sharing connection through stories and ideas and found in books, and introducing everyone to the people who create them. So in that spirit, we are so pleased and honored to welcome Gayle Tzemach Lemmon, the reporter, author, producer, TED Talk success, and perennial spotlight shiner on how women serve and lead their communities in American institutions and across the globe. And as we go on, if you have questions for Gayle, please type them in the Q&A and not the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. And don't be embarrassed about your questions. This story gives so much context. You don't have to be an expert in international politics or history. Just ask your questions. And I will put a link in the chat for those of you. A lot of people have heard about you, but aren't familiar with this. And I will put a link in the chat for how you can get the book from the Country Bookshop. I have so much more to tell everyone about you, but Gayle, really quickly, I just want to share a 1-minute introductory video with everyone about you. If you guys will bear with me, it'll be worth it. It really sets the scene, and I think our if I can. Well, it was the introduction, the video from the Tamron Hall show with the video of the women. Welcome.
Thank you.
I want to begin. I met you during Ashley's War, and I cannot wait to kind of loop that in to our chat. And if any of you women are here, please let us know in the chat. But I actually want to begin by asking you about the Charter of the Social Contract, kind of, starting at the inception. The Women's Protection Unit was fighting for so much more than just territory. Can you just start with that?
Sure. I'm so glad to be here. And I know that some of the amazing soldiers from Ashley's War are also here. I think Amy and several others. I just want to say, hello and thank you. Southern Pines is very special to me. I've spent a lot of time in the community. So thank you for all that you do in the bookstore to really spread community. So important. This book is really about the women who fought the Islamic State and who were America's ground partner in the fight against ISIS. But I think what's so important and what your question is really getting at is that it wasn't just about the military piece.
Yeah.
They really were, as they said, we wanted to show that we could lead in battle so that we could govern in peace. And the book really takes you through this, very far-reaching experiment in women's equality and rights that is happening truly right upon the ashes of the fight against the Islamic State, created in part by women who fought ISIS room by room, house by house, and town by town as America's ground force. And so many in your community know this story. And I would say it's actually been deeply moving to see a lot of service members write and say, this book spoke to me, and it sort of took me back into that experience, because the thing that was always so memorable to me was in an early moment in the book, one of the young women said, who has been fighting ISIS all day in the summer of 2017, and she comes back and says, we're writing our own history now. Mm-hmm. That this is not about just fighting ISIS, it's about a world in which girls and women have value. And so in their founding document, women are mentioned 13 times. Yes to girls' education, no to child marriage, no to dowry, yes to full women's economic rights. And one of the political leaders said to me, we're building a lake in the desert. It doesn't happen quickly, but we have to start somewhere. And it's really about taking you into the battle against ISIS. And this showdown that I could not have invented if I tried, between the men who bought and sold women as a central part of who they were, who end up coming up right against, in every battle, starting in 2014, the women who have women's emancipation and women's rights right at the core of who they are.
It's so true. And as you're going battle by battle, that juxtaposition of these women warriors kind of coming into an area that's been governed by people who've been beaten for moving a veil to like read something at market, or chatting with women who've been sold 10 times and used as a sex slave every single time. I mean, just the contrast, it's so real. You've seen it, but the way it is in the book just floored me. Can you talk about some of those examples?
Yeah, I mean, it's the humanity amid the inhumanity. So there's a moment, Znarine is one of the women you'll meet in this book, right? She is, as a teenager, her family says no to university. It's not what girls in our families do. Then she meets somebody she loves, and her uncle says, no, we've actually picked out somebody that you're to marry. And she says, no, then I'm never getting married. And then when people knock on her door and say, we have this movement for women's rights, she's ready, right? And we follow her journey all the way from being a driver and a gopher, really, for the head of the women's protection units in the battle for Kobani, which is really a David versus Goliath story, where David is also a woman, right? And we follow her all the way from being a driver in that battle to leading the liberation of her hometown from the Islamic State. And girls coming up to her and saying, you know, we didn't know you were real. What is it like to be you? And coming up and really seeing her as a role model. And I want readers to know the journey.
I get chills. Even when you said that, I'm remembering it literally went down my arm. But also the billboards, not in that town, but in Kobani, just where these women, not only are they doing this, not only is this the blueprint, but they're, I mean, you talk about Ashley's War and these incredible women, you know, we don't see billboards of our heroes, our female heroes, and the way that you have pictures of it in the book, the way that they showcase and celebrate these warriors, I think is for these girls is really important as well.
That's right. And you know, that it's not just that too. I mean, this is a town where service is part of it, right? Where you are. When you go to Northeastern Syria, there are pictures of young women and young men on light poles of women and men who are lost in battle, so that you can never forget the sacrifices that other people have made. And it's in every town that you go to across Northeastern Syria. Their pictures are on lampposts and on signs, so that you always remember who sacrificed for your liberties.
So kind of at that intersection of the Daughters of Kobani and Ashley's War. So the whole beginning for you for discovering this story started with some of our US female warriors.
Yes, exactly. And some of you on this call, Amy in particular, will know who it is. You know, one of the young women from young soldiers from Ashley's War, she called me from Syria and she said, you have to come. This is an absolutely incredible story. There are women in the partner force, and they're not just leading in battle, other women, but they're leading men in battle. And they have the full respect of the men they serve alongside and the full respect of the Americans, right? And these are elite US forces who have seen nothing but war in their adult lives, truly, in terms of 12, 13, 14, 15 deployments in these post 9/11 conflicts, so that their families and they live these wars every single day. And this, you know, they had a vision of these women as true warriors who were America's partner in the fight to take back the physical caliphate of ISIS. And she said, and not only that, but they're not just fighting ISIS, they're actually fighting for women's equality. And I thought, you know, how can you not want to know more once you hear that? And that's really what the book is about.
It's true, but I mean, it's also about kind of that spirit of courage and like girl camaraderie amid being just like a sisterhood amongst just being like a I keep wanting to say bad ASSS because that's what that's what they both came through. And also just like the practicality of getting it done, like the practicality of taking towns, you know, what that looks like. I want to take it. You have this moment in the book where Mitch, U.S. Special Forces, is kind of assessing what's going on to decide. Can you talk to that when he gets called out by this warrior who's like, what did you
Yeah,
do?
there's a moment, and actually the U.S. folks who trusted me with their story, I mean, you know, they wanted me to be very clear about how they saw these women. And that story was told to me multiple times from multiple perspectives, which was the Americans after this 2014 battle for Kobani. And you have to remember, at that point, ISIS has not had one battlefield loss. They have only been on a tear, taking town after town. They take the town of Mosul in Iraq. They've already taken Raqqa in Syria, and they're on a tear. No one has handed them a loss. And then comes the town of Kobani, and the world starts to watch this group of Syrian Kurds, truly not many people, including in the US, had ever heard of, offering this resistance, getting pushed to just a couple of blocks in the town of Kobani, but refusing to back down. And the Americans take note, and the Americans are looking for a ground force because at that point, there was absolutely no interest in putting US ground forces into Syria to fight ISIS. And here was potentially an answer to the American policy need, right? Of somebody with aligned interests who also wanted to stop the Islamic State, who already was showing the will to fight. And so, you know, the Americans are watching this, and the book really takes you into the Americans' kind of hunt for both Syria policy and a partner force. And they're watching them, and they think, wait a minute, you know, there are women there, and they don't think that much about it because they're not there. But then later, after Kobani has happened and ISIS has been defeated in that town, the Americans are there and on the ground, and there is a young woman on this balcony as the Americans are sort of winding down at the end of their first couple of days in northern Syria, looking for a base from which they would then operate. And this young woman comes up and says, like, hey, Americans, you know, I bet I killed more ISIS than you. And there's this moment where the US folks who have lived war, right, at their nation's request for more than a decade, kind of take a step back and like, I bet you have, right? Because the Americans are from the air. And these folks, truly, we watch Rojda, one of the women you meet, puts her AK-47 through the wall and brushes up against the leg of an ISIS fighter. I mean, that is the kind of urban combat that they are seeing, and truly room by room. And so he said to me, you know, that was definitely a first for me, but you know, he said it really stayed with me.
But it gets to the gumption and the truth of what they're doing. But just that closeness to the enemy, one of the things that just really resonated with me was the fact that on the radios, they could communicate with their enemy. I mean, that just blew my mind in terms of the practicality of how this war was fought and the closeness of the enemy. And
that's right,
the knowledge.
That's right. And it was so interesting because I think as an American, I thought of ISIS in many ways as an abstraction. Yeah. You know, those guys who make the slick videos and are truly barbaric in the crimes against humanity that they commit. But for these women, they were the guy in the next room aiming at them.
Literally.
Right? And they talked about them with a deep understanding and a connectivity of their adversary. And it's true, ISIS guys, and I kept asking, I mean, I asked this probably at least 150 times across interviews, what was it like to hear them on the radio talking to you? And they would get on the radio and say, we're going to come find you, we're going to come enslave you, we're going to come hunt you down, be prepared. And the women, you know, Rojda or Nowruz, they wouldn't actually answer, but they're, you know, the younger people, the sort of more junior fighters would. And sometimes the young men would get on the radio and be like, you know, you're so tough, you're such a man, why don't you show yourself? And sometimes ISIS would, right? Because they would get in this back and forth.
Right.
And like, how, you know, mind-boggling that must be. And there was a real volley of words going on throughout.
Well, so, I mean, all those interviews kind of asking over and over, I know how thorough you are, and I'm so sorry I couldn't share the screen to really see the images of you on the ground. And I will share when I send out this video, I will actually share that link. So I think it's such a great explanation of your dedication to your job and telling these stories. But can you talk a little bit about the process of those interviews as you're building this book?
Yes, they're deeply tedious. Some of you on this call can attest to that. I mean, so I told my colleague Mustafa at the beginning, I was like, I promise you this will be worth it, but it's going to be excruciating in the meantime, because we have to go back to the same people over and over and over. And then we have to take what they say and match it to what others say. And then we have to match it to pictures and match it to video and match it to first person accounts that already exist and to news reports at the time, to academic papers, to any number of perspectives that you can find, trying to get this as right as anybody can. And so I even toward the end, so Rojda is this woman who was a commander in the fight against the Islamic State to retake Raqqa, which was the so-called capital of ISIS, from which they planned attacks against a number of places, including those that are near and dear to us here in the United States.
Map.
And it's right, and there's a map to kind of help folks along. So she is this very introverted, loves soccer, is a huge Diego Maradona fan, loves books, never envisioned herself in this, right? And I think that's so important. They weren't superhuman, right? These are normal people who rise to the moment in extraordinary circumstances. And Rojda is really like, you know, in this moment where she's up against ISIS, who's talking about her. And she's, you know, as just like, listen, you know, in some ways it's a backhanded compliment that they think I'm important enough to be talked about. But she said she would always dismiss it. But there's a moment in Kobani where, for those of you who have very persistent parents, you will appreciate this story, which is that in the middle of the battle for Kobani against ISIS, her phone rings and it's her mother. And she knows she cannot not answer the phone because her mother will be sure she's dead. And then she would just start calling everybody else in the family. So in the middle of a firefight, she literally picks up her phone in the battle for Kobani and just holds it up so that her mother hears the bullets going by and then starts wailing and crying and, you know, is so upset, but at least she knows she's okay and answers the phone. Anyway, Rojda is giving regular media interviews in 2017 because CNN and others keep asking the status of the ISIS fight. And at the end, they say, how do you feel when they finally, and readers are there for this, liberate Raqqa from the Islamic State after a brutal campaign? And she says, well, I'm just glad I don't have to talk to you all anymore about the reporters. And she would joke with me, Gayle, like, how many interviews are you going to make me do for this? You know, this is just the only good thing about the book being done is I won't have to sit down for another 3 hours every time you come. So that is the process. So you have to just sit and review and review and review.
Well, you do paint a picture not just of intimate on the ground, but also the larger political forces that are alliances and decision making in a really accessible way. And one of the ways that also brought what was happening, you know, in the same way of your mom calling you in the middle of a firefight, was the social media.
Yeah.
And how that influenced even the wives of some of the male fighters, but also then the American understanding. And that just really, I hadn't thought about that. And I was wondering if you could talk to that in the book, but also kind of just what that means in the greater context that I don't know. And you, I'm sure, do.
Yeah, I mean, look, this book shows how this war was playing out in real time across social media platforms. Both ISIS recruited using Facebook, using Twitter, using any number of social media platforms. I've interviewed women who married Islamic State fighters and came from Europe, came from British Guyana to the Islamic State, recruited on social media. And the book really takes you into both the Americans with their families, right? The folks in your community and military communities across the country whose wives, in some cases, whose partners in other cases are watching. They see on CNN there are women fighting ISIS, and then they go on Twitter and they go on Facebook and they're like, oh, I heard they had a bad day today. When they come home, they're like, wait a minute, how do you know that? Well, you know that because it's all being posted in real time. ISIS was also showing horrible videos of the fight that it would share on its social media platforms. And then when the world won't come, as you'll see in the book, when the world is not coming to the aid of this, you know, a kind of ragtag fighting force that is putting up resistance to ISIS, social media takes over, and so does CNN. right? It gets catapulted onto the global stage, and people in the US, people in Europe, people around the world are like, wait a minute, because they can see it, they keep pushing their governments like, we have to do something. How are we going to let this fighting force that's up against a wall and really bringing it to ISIS, how are we going to let them collapse? And we really go into the world in which US policymakers in Washington and in Northern Iraq are asking themselves the same question.
It's one of those things where I think about, we talked about how when these fighters were acutely aware they were creating their own history. I also think about, as people go back and study this, that's going to, I mean, obviously it's so right now and affecting everything, but just in this particular story, in that way, being able to watch from here, your loved ones there was just kind of wild.
And also thinking about women here in the US, watching those women stand up to ISIS and being completely motivated to follow them and want to learn more every day.
Well, that's what makes this so brilliant. I mean, there are other, I'm just going to go right into this, which is what I was going to end with. But I mean, this story has already taken, I mean, it came out how many weeks ago?
Oh, every day's the year in COVID. I don't know, probably about 3 weeks, I think 2.5 maybe.
I mean, already, even before it came out, but getting this story in the hands of American women and sharing it, what kind of feedback have you gotten as people encounter these women and their stories?
Oh, it's so motivating, right? Because I hope people are inspired. And Tamron did an amazing segment about just inspiration from, and I love her just as a reporter too, about people finding inspiration in unlikely places. Mary Louise Kelly, when we did the All Things Considered segment, said, this isn't what you think when I say it's a story coming from Syria. This is a story of deep inspiration. And just seeing both dads write to me, saying that they're reading it with their daughters, and young women writing to me saying, this book really just blew away all the notions I had about what was possible and what we could do. I mean, it's deeply moving.
I think it's interesting too, this coming out in this time of the pandemic where a lot of people are recalibrating. I mean, just as American women, a lot of people who have not had the experiences of our warriors and our friends you feature in Ashley's War, who are all of a sudden have a different kind of understanding when you're confronted with something, you're like, okay, I'm taking care of myself, taking care of my block, and have a really different way to receive the book in terms of just taking care of what's in front of you because you have to, and imagining a better world.
Right. We all have women in our neighborhoods and our communities who say, I stand up for this and I'll do anything I can to protect the people I love and to protect my town, to protect my home, to protect my relatives, to protect my neighborhood. And that's really what this story is about, right? These young women, when they took up arms, many of them never expected to be fighting ISIS. And they definitely did not expect that I would be in the US talking about them one day, right? Because it was really a local story, right? About this chaos of the civil war comes, and this group of Syrian Kurds who were little known outside their own borders were organized, and they took up arms to keep other people out and to bring some level of security to their area as the chaos of the Syrian civil war turned more and more serious and went from a peaceful democratic protest. The children, scrawled on the wall and launched inadvertently to a real hotbed of extremist forces coming in. And it's ISIS that eventually draws the Americans in. It is, how do we counter the Islamic State? Because they were seen at that moment as a direct threat to the homeland and a direct threat to Europe, a direct threat to Asia, or a direct threat to the world.
You talk about the graffiti that the kids scrawled on their wall and then just got annihilated. But I also do think back to the graffiti that our warriors scrawled on the wall, like, we will die.
Yeah, that's right. And that was the thing, right? So these women, there's the Americans go to take a tour of Kobani after the fight has been won, and they have seen it from the air for months and months, but they haven't seen it from the ground. And as you'll see in the book, their hosts, take them, they want to show what they've done, what they've achieved. And they see this graffiti on the wall that says, "We will fight to the last one." And that really moves the Americans, right? And I think it's so important because the folks in the US were, they're not the subject of the story, but they were a real part of bringing it to life. And they talked to me at length about how moved they were by what they saw as the warrior ethos that these women shared. And one of them said to me, I was a little worried at the beginning. I'd never worked with women in a partner for us. And really by the end, he was talking about how he wanted his daughters to be like them. And I think that just speaks about the journey that everybody who's involved in this book really goes on.
And those of us reading the book, I mean, just go through a journey as well. Now we have a few questions, which we can go to. Actually, I'll say that. So 2 of them are from a dear friend of mine. How much of the difference in how our soldiers, including women, are celebrated on billboards is driven by not fighting on our own soil and thus being able to put it outside of the everyday mind of the average American? And did that help these women accelerate their movement?
So I think the existential piece of this, no doubt, helped them accelerate their movement. I interviewed dads of young women who said to me, and you'll see this in the book, like, I never expected this would be my daughter's world ever, right? And then they kind of hold up a picture and said, but look, she fought for our neighborhood. She fought for our town. In the middle of Kobani, as you'll see in the book, there's a photo of a huge statue to women warriors, right? And to Arim Khan that's in there. In Hasaka, there's a big statue of women. I mean, it almost feels like science fiction, truly. And that's what I wanted readers to go on the journey with me, because I always enter a story saying, every great story starts with a question you can't answer. And I truly could not answer the question of how in the world one of the most far-reaching experiments in women's equality anywhere was coming to life on the ashes of the fight against ISIS. And this is where, part of what the book sets out to answer.
Well, and part of that too is and you provide such incredible context in the book for what was happening on this land to the Kurds and what the scenario was as you do enter this. And I kind of started in with probably far too intense of a question, but going back to the council,
the women's council,
social contract,
yeah,
and where that came from, and what is it,
Öcalan, yeah,
Öcalan, and even. Can you talk a little bit? I keep going back, but I think that's my question that I want to answer is, what does this government look like? Like, is this the Magna Carta? Like, this is awesome.
It does look different when women lead, right? But this is the policy tightrope the Americans have walked the whole time. This group of Syrian Kurds follows a leader who is in Turkish prison named Abdullah Öcalan, who launched an armed struggle for Kurdish rights in Turkey, and ends up becoming a prisoner on an island in Imrali Island in Turkey. And from there starts writing about how the Kurds cannot be free until women are free. And that the history of enslavement is one of that men are enslaved because women aren't equal, and the housewifeization of women's work. And he's reading while in prison the works of a former communist turned anarchist turned really grassroots democracy advocate in Vermont named Murray Bookchin, who very few people in this country has ever heard of, to the left of Bernie Sanders, right? His ex-wife fought Bernie Sanders on a waterfront development project in Burlington. And he reads this work of Murray Bookchin that says, you don't need a nation state, you need local New England style town hall democracy that has no hierarchy and environmental awareness right at its center. So those ideas meet Öcalan's notions of true Kurdish equality Kurdish liberation can only come with women's liberation. And all these ideas come together in this experiment in Northeastern Syria, in a sliver of land recognized by nobody outside its borders. And then the Islamic State throws it onto the global stage because the Americans choose this group of people as their partners because they have the will to fight, they have the warrior ethos to fight, and they have notions that the Americans feel like they not only can get behind, but have deep respect for. And it's that partnership that we watch grow from 2014 really through today.
But it's combined with vision, which is like just the element that gets me. I have another question that's
And actually, one point about that's so interesting, right? Is that Fauzi Yusuf, when I was asking her, I said, and it's in the book, I said, didn't people tell you this is too much too fast? All this talk about equality and women's rights. And she said, of course they did, but we don't care. Just said, we're not interested in that. Like, this is what we're supposed to be doing in this moment. And if we don't take our rights now, when will we take them?
Well, I can only imagine they're like, well, first of all, I've been shot at for this. Half my friends have died. And I've watched, if I don't do this, everybody gets stolen into sex slavery. You're like, I mean, so I will jump from the gender question actually to Mary Lynn's question, who is asking about the film directed by a woman. When can we expect it? Because it has everything.
So the Ashley's War film, as some of you know, is in the process of becoming a film at Universal, with Reese Witherspoon producing and Leslie Linka Glatter from Homeland directing, which is amazing. This book, Daughters of Kobani, has been optioned, and it's in the process of becoming a TV of a screen series. But I don't know if we say TV anymore because everybody watches it on all their devices. But right, it's some kind of a broadcast series. And I want everybody to meet these women. I mean, I want you to meet Azima, who, gets shot by ISIS, and I only laugh because if you meet her, when you meet her in the book, she is just this swashbuckling, chain smoking, hilarious character who was a high school volleyball star and actually reminded me of so many of the young women in Ashley's War, right? And just who they were and in her mindset, who, look, the Islamic State, she leads from the front, which is what makes the men and the women who fight with her really deeply moved to follow her wherever she goes. And we follow her, ISIS grazes her with a bullet. They hit her, right? They shoot her with bullets that actually land quite near her heart. And she gets out of her hospital bed for the press conference after the battle for Kobani, just to say, I want the world to know women have been a part of this fight. And she's also just, very funny. I interviewed her with her sister, which you'll see in the book. Her sister also calls during the middle of the battle for Kobani, and she thinks it's her commander, and she picks up the phone, and it's her sister saying, how are you? Is everything okay? And she's like, I told you not to call me. We're busy fighting ISIS here. I told you don't need me to come sit next to you on the sofa and make you feel better. Like, we're doing something here. I promise you, we will not fall to ISIS, and we will absolutely win. And at that point, very few people believe, including US officials who are in the book, right? Very few people believe Kobani can survive, but she always had faith.
So they reminded me of your Ashley's War women too, which I'm not anywhere near even close to as cool, but they also reminded me of me and my friends and just every woman everywhere, which I think is why this is both Ashley's War and the Daughters of Kobani all of your work is so universal, and that's part of the way you portray people. Another question that to not graciously segue to, in the US, the push for gender equality in the workplace has forced us to revisit gender roles at home, since it's hard for women to work and take care of kids. Well, definitely, Michelle, and take care of kids and home. I'm curious if you saw any of these downstream effects with these women, or if it's too soon.
Oh, absolutely. So the book takes you into the opening of the Raqqa Women's Council. This is genuinely only months after women have been bought and sold on the streets of Raqqa by ISIS. Women are a huge part of getting rid of the Islamic State in the town. It's a truly difficult military campaign that is grueling, as you'll see in the story. And months later, I attended the opening of the Raqqa Women's Council, and I went in deeply cynical because I thought, oh, this is something for foreigners. They want everybody to see how progressive they are. No other foreigners there except for one or two other European folks who actually spend much of their year in Northeastern Syria. No US security forces visible at all local folks, and women everywhere, from the Arab community, from the Kurdish community, from across the board in Raqqa. And a little girl is in the center of this circle as all these people, men and women, dance and have music and everything that would have been off limits. All this joy. And you think this is what they fought for.
I mean, I know that your detail, you write down to the little pearls on her red dress. I mean, what these stories you're telling just come alive. And I'm just so grateful to you for spotlight shining the way you do. We have a question from a writer who is with us. Did researching and writing this book change your perspective as a woman living in America?
So it's very interesting. My father's from the region, and you'll see in the opening to the book, this is probably the most personal book that I've written. My father was born in Baghdad, and I talk about in the prologue to the book that we had this moment when I was a kid and I was giving him a very hard time because the women in his family were doing all this cooking and all this cleaning. And I was like, why can't you cook and clean? And he looked at me and he goes, do you really think men and women are equal? And he didn't mean it in any insulting way. It was just like if I had said that there are giraffes that live on Mars and eat, Malamars every morning, right? Like it was so absurd to him from the world that he came from. So I had a slight fraction of an inkling of an idea of what the women's journey would have been. And so when I received a call from one of the young soldiers of Ashley's War that this was happening, it was what made it impossible for me to turn away. And I actually, this is the first book that's actually also dedicated in part to my father. And it talks about to Eli, who taught me to love pistachios, Marlboro Reds, and the proper taste of watermelon, because he always would say that the watermelon only tasted good in the Middle East, was only sweet enough in the Middle East. So I think that helped me have some sense of it. But I think the research really moved me in terms of the US side. And General Allen, the retired four-star, and I did Christiane Amanpour's show yesterday. And he was talking at length about how surprised the US was, how much he loved the Daughters of Kobani, and how surprised the Americans were about the fact that there were women on the ground putting up the fight against ISIS.
Tell the story of the shaking hands.
Actually, it was a U.S. service member, special operations community member, told me this hilarious story, and he told it to me several times about how they were at a rally point when there were a group of young women who were going to go off and fight ISIS. So the partner force was going to go off to battle. I think this was the town of Shaddadi at the time. And he was with somebody from another branch of the military from his, and who was new to this region and new to this fight and new to this partner force. And so this service member the American goes up to this young man who's part of the Syrian Democratic, they was part of the fighting force. I think they'd just been named the Syrian Democratic Forces. And he puts his hand out and he says, hello, and introduces himself. And he's like, if you're looking for my commander, she's right here. And the special operations soldier was laughing, because he knew, but he figured he would just let this person find out for themselves what he already had learned, which was that women were leaders in this force.
Well, in a way, and this goes back to what Michelle asked earlier, it's so unconscious, I think. And sometimes you have to be shown in a different way. And I think a lot of that, this book, these images, this story being told through so many different forms and medium will do that. And I'm just so excited to see how this carries through the world and the tendrils of what you are shining a spotlight on, where they go and what they do. And I just want to thank you so much for being here, for supporting the bookshop, and
absolutely,
and for supporting the women and men in our community with Ashley's War, and giving everybody in the world a chance to know them and now know these fierce warriors as well.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And I would say, please share this book. It's amazing to see it really get attention and love from the public and become a bestseller very quickly and move people well beyond, I think, what its expectations might have been in this moment. When people are worried about, of course, rightly, what's happening in the US, I think we all need inspiration. And we need stories that remind us of the power to rewrite the rules governing our own lives. And I think that is ultimately what so much of this story is about. There's a moment that I just want to share with you, I think that always stayed with me. And I made them tell me, everybody I interviewed repeat the story to me multiple times, which is that there's a moment in the battle for Kobani where it looks like things are really lost. They're down to very few streets left. And it looks like ISIS will win. And they stop giving press statements and everything else. And what happens is they're low on people, they're low on food, they're low on weapons, they're low on ammunition, to the point that they would wait to shoot at the enemy until they would get close enough to not waste bullets, right? That's the level of at which they were. But Nowruz, the head of the women's protection units, her motivation was, we still have will. And she gets on the radio to Azima and Roja and the other frontline commanders and says, these men think you are worth nothing. You have to show them what you are made of and what you're capable of, so that even if this is our last breath, it will stand for something. And I think that speech really, it was like, if I tried to write that, I couldn't have, right? That was repeated to me by multiple people, that at their darkest moments, hearing that stayed with them and made them think that more was possible than what they had expected when they started the night. And I hope that's what will stay with readers.
It's the ultimate pep talk. It is like the absolute ultimate pep talk. Before I asked you one last question, the book I put into the chat, you can get from the Country Bookshop. You can get all of Gayle's books there. We have autographed book plates. If you want any help making this into a great book club event, or mother-daughter book club, father-daughter book club, Father's Day is coming up, I'll help you figure out how to get this into everybody's hands.
And I actually I told everybody who pre-ordered that I would call into their book clubs. But for Country Bookshop, if there are book clubs that want to read the book, for Country Bookshop, I will do that. I will absolutely be delighted to do 30-minute call-ins and answer all your questions, because I love book clubs. I love my book club ladies and men. Sorry, I don't mean to leave men out at all. But I love interacting with book clubs too. I actually always learn so much from readers and what they take from the book. And often they see things that I never did.
It's fascinating too, especially this book. And as as Ashley's wore, I would take it to book clubs of different generations, and I can understand how, just for me as a bookseller familiar with the book, it showed me more. I can only imagine for you, but I could keep chatting with you forever. Honestly, is there anything you want to leave our audience tonight, or tell anybody?
Maybe just this. I never set out to write books that had women as the main characters. It's just that so rarely do we get to see women on our pages with all the marvelous complexity of the women in our lives. Mm-hmm. And I really want us to take seriously the notion that women's stories are universal, just like men's stories are universal, that it is not the gender barrier that keeps stories from being deeply personal and universal. And I'm so moved to see people love the women in this book and the men they get to meet. And I appreciate all of you sharing this and sharing it with your neighborhoods and with your communities, because we can do all the media in the world. And we've been so blessed with this book to do Good Morning America and Morning Joe. And we're waiting for Peace to run right now on NBC Nightly News, and it'll be on Fox News soon. I think it was on Christian Broadcast Network today. But all the media in the world doesn't make as much of a difference as a reader telling another reader, I loved this book, and pick it up. So that is my charge to all of you. Go out and share this book with the world, because it means so much to people who have sacrificed so much so that there is no physical territory held by ISIS today. And these are people who sacrificed so much for you and for me.
I lied. I'm asking one more question.
No problem.
So you said in one of those media interviews that the book is about to be published in Syria in the language.
Yeah.
Okay, I have two more questions. Can you tell our audience like what that means, given the history of the region and how that happened? And
So early, one amazing colleague of mine, Kamaran, who you'll meet at the beginning, when we go to the front line, the very opening of the book, we go to the front line of the ISIS fight, which was truly terrifying. I mean, honestly, I've seen a decent amount in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, but this was really for me the scariest. And we go to the front line with Clara, one of the women commanders, and she is literally like she's in Southern Pines downtown going to the steakhouse. She's like,
going along.
can you imagine? Yeah, she's like, can you imagine ISIS? Look at this. This is they're throwing these car bombs and everything. And she's pointing to a car bomb that is still smoking. And we're all kitted up in our hat. You know, we have our vests on, we have Keller, we have her helmet. She's nothing. She's literally a scarf on her head. And I realized like, this is her commute to work. This is what she's lived every day for years, fighting the men of the Islamic State. And so Cameron, who got us that access, wrote to me and said, my friend has a publishing house and he wants to know if you will publish in local language. And it couldn't mean more that people who this story belongs to will get to read it in their local language, Kurdish, and also in Arabic, and that will be part of bringing this story home, truly.
Well, and part of I learned so much about the Kurdish history in the region, not being able to celebrate holidays, not being able to publish. So
in their own language, not being able to name their babies what they wish, all this stuff, right?
So when I think about that, this book and this story is going to be part of the core canon, you know, going forward. I mean, that it's being published, it just adds to a further layer of the importance of this story. And I won't ask my second question. It was,
oh, you can. We saw it's fine.
I know. I've still got 2 minutes. Okay, you know, back to my obsession. The Charter of the Social Contract. I was wondering, can you say that in the language? How do they refer to it in their language? Like, what does that sound like if it's coming out of?
You know, that's a good question. I will get back to you on that because it's funny. I just always heard people talk about it as the compact or the contract.
Okay.
And there is a Kurdish word for it, but they always spoke to me about it in English. And I studied Kurdish. I want you to know I was a terrible student. I had an amazing Kurdish teacher, but I had for my first book, The Dressmaker of Khair Khana, about a teenage girl whose business supported her family under the Taliban. So all these girls who were breadwinners during years they couldn't be on their own streets. I had learned Dari basically from an Iranian actress in Los Angeles. And Kurdish, Kurmanji, that dialect Kurmanji, and Farsi are almost exactly the same in certain words. So every time I would go to speak Kurdish, it would come out in Farsi. And it was just like to the point that people would be like, Gayle, please. Like it's causing so much more headaches in our interviews. You're making our interviews last so much longer. But I knew how to say, hello, how are you? And I could get by for sure. But the political piece was so interesting to me too, because I will say just maybe as a final note here, I have never anywhere in the world seen women more comfortable with power and less apologetic about being in charge. There was a moment in the story where in Hasaka, our car breaks down and 3 young women from the women's protection units take us back to our hotel. They give us a lift back. And there are 3 of them and they're all, you know, like young women, they're hanging out and high five, you know, being funny with each other. And from the rear view mirror where we have like air fresheners is a picture of another young woman who's one of their friends who gave her life fighting the Islamic State. And she kind of travels with them everywhere they go. And they're like going through all these checkpoints and they're high-fiving the other young women and they're giving them hugs as they go through the checkpoints. I thought, it just looks like so dramatically different because we don't have in our visual library what it looks like for 30 or 40 or 50 young women in fatigues with smiley face socks and hiking boots, flowers in their hair, braids in their hair, and AK-47 slung around their shoulders going off to fight ISIS.
Well, now you've given, I mean, they've done it and you've given it to us. And that sentence that you're saying right now, as you're bringing this out into the world, that's no longer true. Like, honestly, it's like we now have this as a part of our visual library because you've given it to us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, truly, because we can write all we want, but if readers don't take it to heart and don't take it personally, it doesn't change the world. So thank you.
All right, I'm ending on that. Thank you guys for being here. Send this, so everybody who signed up, I'll send links to buy it and this video, and that is a great way to share it. We'll send an email out from where you registered with this video, and then you can just forward that on to everybody you know. All right, bye guys. Thank you, Gayle. Thank you.
Thank you.